G'day, my name is Pete. Welcome back to the channel. So no doubt there's a lot of parents out there who are now wondering, are the children better off staying at home, or are the kids actually better off being at school now? In a couple of days' time, the school holidays will finish. Are we better off sending them back to school, assuming you even have that option, or should you keep them at home for a few more weeks? Give the situation a chance to play out so that you have a bit more information and perhaps you'll make a more informed decision further down the track. Well, the federal government's guidelines or recommendations on this have been fairly clear. The Prime Minister has said that children who are in years 11 or in year 12 should definitely go back to school if they can and learn in a face-to-face environment. But what about children that are in years 7 to 10, or what about primary school children? Well, the government once again has been fairly clear on that, in that the decision is up to the parents. But the situation is quite different because different states have made different rules and they've all have different policies, and different schools even are in different situations. So some have incidents of CV-19 positive persons at the school where the situation is very different and the policy there is absolutely close the whole school down. Other schools, whether they have positive cases or not, have just made the decision to close down the school. But other schools have left the decision up to the parents. So, I'll run through what all the different states are doing. I'll run through what some of the different school policies are. And I'll give you some information so that you can make an informed decision as to what's best for your child. And then towards the end of the video, I'll go through a bit of a process that my wife and I went through in trying to decide as to what would be the best for our children. I'll go through some of the steps with the view of hopefully it being of some help to you as well. So stay tuned for that. That's right at the end of the video. My name is Pete and you're watching Ahead of the Curve. Okay, so let's have a look at what everyone else is doing. So I'll run through what the different states are up to, but just keep in mind that obviously the exception is for essential workers and any other workers who can't physically perform their employment duties from home, who have to go to work. So, essential workers obviously have to look after the rest of us in the community, and their children might not be able to stay at home, and they might not have anyone else to look after their children at home. The exception obviously is also to anyone else who might have a member of the family or in the household who's got a pre-existing medical condition, there'll be exceptions obviously, but generally speaking, the states seem to be divided into four separate, fairly broad groups. So we've got Canberra or ACT and Victoria, where schools closed for the whole of term 2. Then we've got Queensland and Tassie. So they're going with the approach of online or online schooling for the first 5 weeks of term 2. And then New South Wales, they're going with a staggered approach where they're going to start 1 day a week from the 11th of May and just see how that pans out before they go to letting children come back to school more than 1 day a week. And then we've got the last category, which is 3 states: South Australia, Northern Territory and WA, which is where I am. And here, it sort of seems to depend on whether your children go to a public school or a private school. So public schools are going to remain open. Private schools seem to have quite a different approach, so especially the high schools. So it seems like the thinking is, okay, year 11 and year 12 students have to come to school. They're encouraged to come to school, so we're going to encourage them to come to school. But in order to make the environment as safe as possible for the teachers as well as the students, what we're going to try and do is spread them out as much as possible. So what we'll do is we won't let children from year 7 to 10 come to school, and we'll use those classes to enable to spread the year 11 and year 12s out across the other classes, so that they can be a little bit further apart, which makes complete sense, which I completely support, and I think that's a great idea and a great way to go. Okay, so for those who have children in public schools or schools where they're encouraging or at least letting the children go back to school, you now have a decision to make. Do you send them to school or do you keep them at home? So look, obviously every parent wants to do the right thing by their child, and look, generally speaking, obviously kids learn better in a school environment. Sure, there's exceptions, and some children will learn better in a homeschooling environment, and some parents are great homeschoolers, but for the most of us, we're better off sending our kids to school. But now there's a risk in doing so. Now, sure, I understand. So children, immune systems are different. So first of all, they're less likely to contract the virus in the first place. If they do contract it, their immune systems are less likely to overreact to the virus, and hence they're less likely to have severe symptoms. So we know that. And we also know that because they're less likely to contract it, they're less likely to be carrying the virus. But I'd like to make 3 points there. First of all, less likely doesn't equal impossible. So we've seen there was a 5-year-old girl who died in Michigan. There was a infant who died in Illinois. So, you know, and that's just me having a quick look on the internet. So, and it's interesting, and this sort of tells us just how little we still know about the virus. Researchers or even medics, they don't know why young people are dying to the virus. So obviously most aren't, but why some people are. So there's two theories. So one is the viral load. So the theory there is that the children who have died, they've been exposed to a higher dosage of the virus, and that's perhaps overwhelmed them or generated this unusual immune response. There's also another theory, which is genetics. So the idea is that some children might be genetically more susceptible or more disposed to contracting the virus or not being able to handle it. So, but look, bottom line is those are just the two theories. So the genetics and the viral load are just two theories. At the end of the day, we really don't know, and we'll need obviously more research, etc. So the point I'd like to make there is less likely does not equal impossible. The other point I'd like to make is because children's bodies are naturally better equipped at handling the virus, there's less chance that they'll present symptoms, which means they're more likely to be asymptomatic, which means that your guard might be down. You might be thinking my child is perfectly fine, he or she doesn't have any symptoms, yet they may well be contagious, and they may present a risk by bringing a virus from school. Maybe they contracted from another child or from a teacher or just from the environment, and pass it on to you or their grandparents. As the federal government's chief medical officer has himself stated, one person can infect as many as 40 people. So obviously you need to be really careful. The other point to make with children is, generally speaking, their hygiene isn't as good as it is with adults as well. So they're more likely perhaps to be carrying the virus on their hands, etc. Now, I did say generally speaking because, you know, there are some adults who are worse than 2-year-olds in their hygiene, and the number of times I've seen you know, people in the men's toilets going to the toilet and just walking past the sink and not even washing their hands, and it just aggravates me every time I see it. But that's a topic for another video. So yes, children are more likely to have poorer hygiene and hence more likely to have the virus on their hands, etc. Either because they are less patient and they don't wash their hands properly, or just because of general hygiene altogether. Which brings me to the other thing I wanted to talk about, and that's I talked about this in my previous videos, but just wanted to reiterate the point that, you know, let's not forget that the way this virus spreads is through droplets. And those droplets can be as tiny as 5 microns. To put that into perspective, an average human hair is between 60 and 120 microns thick. So the droplets that are small enough to still carry the COVID-19 virus can be as small as 24 times the size of the average thickness of a human hair. So they're tiny. Now, because they're tiny, it means that they can remain suspended in the air, in the atmosphere. So what could actually happen is someone could sneeze or cough, and someone else could maybe even an hour or 2 hours later, if the droplets can stay suspended in the air for a couple of hours, someone else could walk through that air, inhale the droplets, and perhaps become exposed to the virus as well. Perhaps not in a large dose, but become exposed to it nevertheless. The other thing the other point I'd like to make is, and sorry, just going back to that, that's why N95 masks and glasses may be effective, or may definitely help, at least in reducing perhaps the load, the viral load, should you walk through a situation like that. The second point I'd like to make, and I've made this in my previous videos as well, is the virus can live on surfaces for as long as 72 hours, and there's some reports that, especially on metal surfaces or even plastics, it can remain in a live form there for days and days, so several days. So not just 72 hours, but 4, 5, 6, 7 days. Now, look, yes, even things like cardboard, apparently the half-life of the virus is about 14 hours. Look, that's still more than long enough for your child to pick up that virus, or for it to be transmitted onto their school bag, their clothes, maybe perhaps even in their hair or what have you, and then for you to touch their school bag or whatever it is, and then put your hand towards your nose or your mouth, or rub your eyes, and hence contract it that way. So obviously much less likely, and perhaps the viral load isn't as intense, but still a risk nevertheless. So another point I like to make is, yes, the statistics are very low at the moment. The new cases are almost non-existent. Here in Western Australia, we had 0 new cases today, which is fantastic. And even over the last 4 days, I think we've only had 2 new cases. We only have 88 remaining active cases in WA, and only 5 people in intensive care, which is absolutely fantastic, and shows just how effective self-isolation or distance isolation really is. Now, what I'd like to say to that point is that don't let that give us a false sense of security, because there's a reason why the numbers are so low, and that's because we are self-distancing. As soon as we start going back to schools, as soon as we start going back out into the community and start interacting with each other, as we've seen in Singapore, no doubt those numbers will begin to rise. The other point I'd like to make also is there's no point in looking at the cases in isolation. They really need to be looked at in the context of the testing regime. And the question there is, is the testing broad? I mean, obviously, if you have no tests, you're going to have hardly any cases. So is the testing broad? And the other thing, it's not just the amount of tests that we're doing, which is very important, but also, if we're testing all the people that are not likely to have the virus, well, that's that will give you one outcome, and testing people that are very likely to have it will give you another outcome. So what I'm trying to say there is the testing has to be not only broad, but it has to be targeted, and that's what the new app, that the Trace Together app, is all about. I made, and I'll refer you to my previous video where I talked about the app, and I'll leave a link in the description section below so you can go directly to that video. But basically what I was trying to say in that video is this is why South Korea has been really effective with, at least initially, with keeping the virus at bay, is because they were not only testing fairly broadly, but they were very targeted with their testing. What they would do is they would find a CV-19 positive case, and then they would backtrace all the people that person has come into contact with in the last 14 days. And they did that through the GPS data in their phone. So that's a very effective way to test. And unfortunately, we aren't doing that in Australia as yet. So as soon as we start testing in, using those sort of methods, no doubt the numbers will go up as well. So don't just trust the numbers. Keep in mind that the actual numbers may actually be higher than the numbers that are being reported. There was a report recently saying that the actual cases in the United States may be 40% more than what's actually being reported, which is quite incredible. The other point also to make is that any any cases that you see, and I've made this point before, any cases that you see in the media, they may well be 2 to 5 days old, because that's how long it takes for the test to turn around. And yes, we can have urgent tests come back fairly quickly, but they seem to still take about 48 hours, I think, 2 days on average, and some can take 4 or 5 days. So any numbers that you're seeing are numbers from at least a couple of days ago, so keep that in mind as well. Okay, so now that you have that information, which I thought was pretty important to have that information to be able to make an informed decision, let's now have a look at the decision process that my wife and I went through until the decision was taken out of our hands. As I said, our school put in place fairly clear instructions, which were basically, if your children aren't in year 11 or 12, don't send them to school unless there's very exceptional circumstances. So let me quickly run through what my wife and I, the decision process that we adopted, and yeah, it seemed to definitely help us, and perhaps it will help you as well. 2 points to make in regards to this. So first of all, obviously everyone's situation will be very different. So this is, consider this speaking in general terms. So make sure you adapt this obviously to your particular situation. So that's point number one. Point number two, this is all based, as I've written up the top there, it's all based on all else remaining equal. So obviously you could get to a situation where, okay, you've decided to keep your kids at home, but as a result of them being at home, they've hurt themselves for whatever reason. But look, you could say the same thing if they went to school, they could hurt themselves at school. So, that's what I mean by all else remaining equal. So, so keep that in mind, obviously, and that allows us to obviously just focus on things that, we can control, etc. So let's have a look. So this here represents the point in time when you're making the decision. So let's say that's now. So there's 2 decisions you can make. You can send your kids to school, or you can keep them at home. And then we looked at the 2 different scenarios that would eventuate as a result, or after sending our kids to school. So the very favourable scenario is represented by the green tick, and the very, very unfavourable scenario is represented by the red cross. So the green tick refers to a situation where we were able to keep the virus at bay, and obviously we did really well, and the situation has kept on improving, and as a result of sending the kids to school, we didn't put them in any significantly additional risk. So in that situation, then we look at the pros and cons of each decision going forward. So what are the pros of sending them to school if the situation turns out to be great? Well, obviously they're much better having been at school. They were with their friends, so socially it's better for the kids, but they were also in a better environment to learn better. So that's the pros. The cons of sending them to school in that situation are pretty much non-existent. So fairly straightforward. Now let's say we send the children to school, but we now look at the opposite end of the spectrum. So let's pretend that the situation has become much worse, it's become quite acute, and the number of cases has really flared up, and the kids have gone to school. So look, the pros are still that they were in a learning environment, they were in a social environment, and more likely to be interacting with other kids, which is great. But look at the cons. I mean, that's a huge downside to sending your kids to school. The downside is it's obviously their health. You've exposed your kids to potentially a deadly virus, and you've potentially, as a result, made yourself and the rest of the family unsafe as well. Let's now have a look at the other situation. Let's say you keep your children at home. Let's say the situation works out to be great. We keep the virus at bay. Let's have a look at the pros and the cons. So you've kept your children at home. There's no problems with the virus. Well, the cons are the children were at home. They could have been at school interacting with other kids and being in a better learning environment. So the con is fairly straightforward. Sorry, there we are. The con is fairly straightforward. But if we keep kids at home and nothing, nothing happens, there's few pros in that situation. let's have a look now at the opposite end of the spectrum. As I said, now the virus has really flared up, but we've kept our children at home. So once again, the cons, they haven't been in contact with other friends at school, they haven't been in a better learning environment, but what a huge pro. We've now prevented putting our children at risk from a potentially deadly virus. So as you can see, there's a huge pro to this course of action, and there's a huge con to that course of action. So if you put it that way, I think it just makes the whole decision process much easier and just makes the situation much clearer. And I mean, obviously I'm coming from the position that you know, you should really be putting health and safety first and education second. So but even so, you know, even if you think the two are closely related, which I would obviously strongly disagree with, and I think most people would agree with me, but even if you're in that situation, you know, the con is just so huge if you send your children out to school and if the situation ends up to be quite bad. Obviously there could be any number of situations in between the two extremes, but that's, you know, that's the way we looked at the situation, and it really helped us and it really made it extremely clear. But like I said, look, that's generally speaking, your circumstances will be very different, and there may be very specific situations or very specific circumstances as to what makes one course of action a much better decision for you particularly, or for your family in particular versus another situation. So look, that's pretty much it from me for now. So hopefully you got some value out of that. If you did, give it a thumbs up. You may know someone else that may be pondering this decision as well, so please do share the video with them. Hopefully they'll get some value out of it as well. And please also subscribe and press the notification bell next to the subscribe button so that you can get alerted to new videos as and when they come out. Some of them are fairly timely. You know, this one perhaps is somewhere in the middle. We are, you know, children are going back to school, or the children's holidays are finishing school, finishing soon, I should say. So it is fairly timely. So press that notification bell so that you can get alerted to new videos as and when they come out. That's it, as I said, from me. So as always, stay safe, stay sustainable, and stay ahead of the curve. Ciao.